No one can tell with certainty what the next war, the next crisis, and the next threat will be. As long as we stand together, North America and Europe, and protect each other, we will be safe, we will be secure.
Unity in the face of uncertainty. In the months leading up to the Washington summit, and as the alliance celebrates its 75th anniversary, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has held press conference after press conference visiting member states and emphasizing the importance of NATO unity in preserving its mission.
NATO's purpose is not to fight the war, but NATO's purpose is to prevent the war.
Though the alliance has evolved and adapted over the last 7 decades, NATO's purpose, to guarantee the freedom and security of its members through its founding principle of collective defense, has remained steadfast.
At the heart of NATO is a commitment from each ally to come to the defense of any other ally that may be the victim of aggression. And that means that a would-be aggressor, considering taking action, knows that if they pick a fight with one, they pick a fight with all.
Article 5 is indeed kind of the linchpin of NATO, the most solemn fundamental commitment that allies accept when they become members of the alliance.
Keep in mind, that joining an international military alliance like the U.S. did, like all the allies did in 1949, this was really a revolutionary foreign policy move for the United States.
NATO is, we should never forget, a political military alliance in that order, and not the other way around. You need political solidarity, you need political cohesion to make NATO function militarily.
Throughout this series, we'll be hearing from people who have dedicated their careers to serving, understanding, and educating about NATO's mission, its work, and its role in preserving transatlantic security. I'm Natalia Gopitnik, Director of Communications at the Foreign Policy Research Institute.
I'm Rick Landgraf, Senior Fellow in the Institute's Eurasia program, and this is The Ties That Bind.
NATO at 75 and beyond. Thanks for joining us.
As the upcoming summit meeting in Washington taking place from July 9th to 11th comes into focus, NATO is increasingly in the news and at the center of policy discussions on both sides of the Atlantic. Leaders, policymakers, and pundits are all asking similar questions. Will NATO invite Ukraine to join the alliance? How can the allies sustain the recent gains made in improving defense spending and burden sharing? And will NATO survive another Trump presidency? While these are all crucial issues affecting the alliance now and into the near future, in this episode, we tackle a more fundamental set of questions, which seek to illuminate NATO's history, purpose, and role. What is NATO? What is the U.S. role within NATO? How and why is it important for U.S. national security? And why should Americans and Europeans care about NATO in the first place? And lastly, how do NATO's current challenges relate to those which have been faced in the past? At a moment when U.S. power and influence in the world are hotly debated, examining the role of NATO can help shed light on the making of U.S. foreign policy and defense strategy, as well as the future of America's role and purpose in the world. To help understand the multifaceted identities of NATO and the history of the alliance and the enduring transatlantic bargain which underpins it, I sat down with Seth Johnston, a United States Army officer, NATO scholar practitioner, and author of How NATO Adapts, Strategy and Organization in the Atlantic Alliance since 1950. Seth, I first want to ask you about NATO and what is NATO. Specifically, what distinguishes NATO from other international institutions?
Well, thanks a lot, Rick. What is NATO is actually a more complex question than you might think, because when people talk about NATO, they often talk about different aspects of this very important security institution. NATO really, I think, is 5 things. NATO is a treaty alliance, based on the North Atlantic Treaty or the Washington Treaty signed in 1949. But secondly, NATO has also become, since its very early days, an international organization. It's got a sprawling international bureaucracy in Europe and North America. It has a variety of specialized technical agencies, and it has a unique multinational peacetime military structure that really is very unusual for international organizations. Third, NATO is an instrument of international military cooperation. That's true of that peacetime military structure. But it's also true of the fact that NATO is often, has been in the last 30 years or so, the institution through which a lot of coalition military activity has occurred. For example, the coalition operations in Afghanistan for so many years in this century were done in a NATO context, even though some of the contributing countries or participating countries in those operations weren't actually members of the alliance. So NATO's an alliance, it's an international organization, it's an instrument for international military cooperation. It's also, people often talk about NATO as a Western alliance or an alliance that epitomizes or underpins a system of values. That attitude can be seen, or that definition of NATO can be seen in the way that the Allies describe the purpose of the alliance itself in the treaty. The treaty says that the Allies are coming together to safeguard the freedom, common heritage, and civilization of their people founded on, and then they enumerate the values that are most important. They say that this civilization is founded on the principles of democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law. And finally, a fifth definition is that NATO can be seen as a transatlantic bargain. The U.S. commits to remaining involved in European security affairs after the two terrible wars of the 20th century. And in return, the European allies agree to organize themselves and participate in the collective defense of the alliance against external threats. But also, the Europeans organize themselves to preserve internal stability, to mitigate the latent tensions among the alliance members themselves. So that's a lot. No wonder everyone talks about how important NATO is. It not only has it been around for a long time, but it's also at least these five things: a treaty-based alliance that's been around for 75 years, an international organization, an instrument of international military cooperation, a community of values, and an important pillar of the transatlantic bargain that has persisted since the end of World War II.
A lot has been made about NATO's founding rationale. To quote Lord Ismay, NATO's first Secretary General, NATO's purpose was to, quote, keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. Can you break down this rationale for us? What does this mean?
Yeah, this is another really good one, Rick. And you're right that NATO nerd people like you and me see this as a little bit of a cliche. First Secretary General Lord Ismay describing NATO's founding rationale to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. In fact, and I've looked long and hard for this, I do not think that statement has ever been really reliably sourced to Lord Ismay. But even though there's no record of it that anybody can find, at least that I know of, this phrase keeps getting used because in many ways it is just the best description of the three main purposes that NATO was established to fulfill. But also in many ways, these purposes remain relevant today. Keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. But let's explain that a little bit because this is, to name these names and countries is a little bit crude. By keeping the Russians out, and this is quite salient today, with the return of war to Europe, the biggest war in Europe since World War II is happening now in Ukraine, and Russia's aggression there is certainly top of mind for allies today, and gives some renewed obviousness to the idea that part of the purpose of NATO should be to defend the allies against Russian aggression. But really what that's about, this idea that NATO's purpose is to keep the Russians out, is that the purpose of NATO, just like any alliance, is to defend the allies against external threats. That's the definition of collective defense. Allies come together to defend one another against external threats. And that was not always just Russia. In fact, the famous Article 5 of the NATO treaty, which is the the article that contains the mutual defense clause, that an attack on one ally is an attack on all allies. That article has been invoked only one time, and that was after 9/11, when allies invoked the treaty and upheld their treaty responsibilities to defend the United States, which had been attacked from an external source, in this case, a terrorist group, not a country. That's what that part of NATO's founding rationale is about. Keeping the Russians out, that's really about the purpose of that one purpose of the alliance is about defending against external threats. When it comes to keeping the Americans in, well, that's about the transatlantic bargain, that the United States would commit to remaining involved in European security affairs in exchange for sharing the burden of collective defense with the European allies, and the commitment from the Europeans that they would organize themselves for internal stability. Keep in mind, that joining an international military alliance like the U.S. did, like all the allies did in 1949, this was really a revolutionary foreign policy move for the United States. For the first 150 years of the United States, the defining theme or attitude towards international alliances was George Washington's advice that the United States ought to avoid entangling alliances, in particular in Europe. And so to overturn 150 years of tradition on George Washington's advice and to become involved in a military and political alliance in Europe, well, that was a big change. And part of the way that we can understand that is because the United States had learned, after having been drawn into the First World War in Europe, and then having effectively gone home, decided not to join the League of Nations and other international institutions. The United States was then drawn back into Europe and to other theaters in World War II. So the lesson after 1945 was that there was an argument for the United States staying involved in European security affairs. But of course, that means a commitment. For the first time in its history, the United States, after World War II, maintained a large standing army, defense infrastructure. These things were new in the American experience, as Dwight Eisenhower said in his own farewell address towards the end of the 1950s. So this is keeping the Russians out, is about defending against external threats. Keeping the Americans in is about that important part of the transatlantic bargain that served both interests. The Europeans enjoyed the benefit of U.S. power, leadership, and involvement in European security affairs, while the United States gained a commitment from those European allies to preserve stability in Europe and to contribute to the collective defense. And that's where also the third part of Lord Ismay's comment about keeping the Germans down is important as well. Really, what keeping the Germans down means is that part of NATO's founding rationale is to mitigate latent hostility or the potential for conflict among European countries themselves. Think about this. In the 70 years prior to the 1940 campaign of World War II, Germany invaded France 3 times. And in the 75 years of NATO, there has been no great power European war among those historically hostile Western European states. So that's a track record of great success. So keep the Americans in, it's part of the transatlantic bargain. Keep the Russians out, that's defending against external threats to the alliance. And keeping the Germans down, that's mitigating latent conflict and hostility among the allies themselves.
Article 5 of NATO's founding treaty is the alliance's collective defense provision. It holds that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against all allies, and they agree that if such an attack occurs, each of them will assist the ally attack by taking such action as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force to restore and maintain the security of the North Atlantic area. Now, Article 5 has been invoked only once in NATO's history, and this was after the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks on the United States. So the security guarantee conferred by Article 5 helps explain why countries such as Ukraine want to join the alliance in the first place. So to find out more about this history in Article 5, I spoke with Jaap Scheffer, the Secretary General of NATO from 2004 to 2009. You served as the NATO Secretary General from January 2004 to August 2009. During this time, NATO was involved in many different missions and operations and activities, from the Afghanistan war to the disagreements over the U.S. war in Iraq. You mentioned NATO enlargement. Of course, 7 countries, the so-called Big Bang enlargement was in 2004, bringing in the Baltic states, and then also Russia's invasion of Georgia in August 2008. What did you do to prepare yourself to tackle these sorts of challenges while in office as the head of NATO?
Well, my first challenge, and that was what I clearly picked up when I was making the rounds before being appointed, when I visited DC, Washington, and of course Paris and London and Berlin. My first challenge was instructions, quote unquote, from the Prime Minister's Chancellor: heal the rift. There was a huge rift in NATO based on Bush and Iraq in 2003. I knew that dossier quite well because I had been foreign minister, and the Dutch had taken a special position in that invasion by giving political support to the US, but not military support. So we were sort of in the middle. Might have been one of the reasons that they finally went for me as NATO SecGen. So that was the first challenge, and in my history, an excellent preparation for the NATO job. But then came, of course, something new. And that something new was what I qualify as the period not only of NATO enlargement, as you mentioned, but also the period of what I qualify as an expeditionary NATO. NATO was expeditionary. NATO was subcontracted by the United Nations Security Council for the huge military operation in Afghanistan. And don't forget, Rick, that it was 100,000 plus boots on the ground in Afghanistan, a faraway country, at a certain stage. And that was, I think, one of my big challenges at a certain stage. We had a combination of 50 NATO allies, NATO partners, from Japan to the United Arab Emirates, from New Zealand, Australia. I mean, it was a huge conglomerate coalition of nations active in Afghanistan. The political control, political leadership, political consistency was a big challenge. The military did very well. The military did very well. My respect for the military only grew when I saw them operate in Afghanistan. The political oversight was difficult. And why was it difficult? Because every nation, and that was relevant for NATO allies and non-NATO allies alike, but I had first of all to deal with the NATO allies, of course, was that every single NATO ally was looking at Afghanistan through a straw. Again, as an example, for the British, they were responsible for the province of Helmand in the south of Afghanistan. They looked through that straw to Helmand, and what happened in Helmand was dominant for their decision-making. The Dutch were in Uruzgan, also in the south. The Italians in the west, the Germans in the north, and the combination of those straws, looking through those straws, made it very complicated. I think we succeeded more or less at the end, for instance, to fully agree on what's our mandate there. What are we doing there? In provinces where there was a huge poppy culture and a drugs culture as a consequence, the allies responsible said, but we cannot deny that there's a huge problem and that the Taliban are gaining enormous sums of money through their poppy culture. And people in other provinces said, no, listen, this is not a priority, you see? So it was a complex and complicated operation. And apart from Afghanistan, we were in Kosovo, we were in the Mediterranean. We were training the African Union forces. I went to Addis Ababa, the headquarters of the AU, the African Union. We even embarked upon a humanitarian operation in Kashmir after an earthquake. And I suddenly, between Indian and Pakistani foreign ministers, to see that NATO was as neutral as possible, because Kashmir, highly contested area, and an expeditionary NATO, which did relatively well in that role, but unimaginable under present circumstances.
Seth Johnston knows NATO organization firsthand as a practitioner and at the on-the-ground level, having served as a NATO task force commander in Afghanistan of a unit composed of soldiers from 9 different NATO countries.
So this was this is a very special and rewarding personal and professional experience for me, a difficult one to be sure, but one that I think really inspired me intellectually to ask more questions about the alliance, to see so many countries working together for common purpose in a place so far away and under such difficult conditions inspired me to ask questions, and it also really impressed me with what NATO allies and NATO as an institution were able to do.
You speak a lot about in your book about how NATO has adapted over the course of its history. How do you see how NATO has adapted to both external shocks and internal challenges in the past? How do those challenges and overcoming those challenges, how do they resemble today's issues within the alliance in terms of burden sharing, NATO's role in the Ukraine war, and also threat perceptions across the alliance?
NATO has a very successful track record of adaptation. There's probably no better illustration of that record than NATO's involvement in Afghanistan. The fact that it was even there. Like we said, NATO's founding rationale in 1949 was talked about, in terms of keeping the Russians out, among other things. And NATO itself is, of course, named in such a way that it's geographically limited to the transatlantic area. So who would have thought in 1949 that a North Atlantic alliance brought about in the Cold War with concerns about defending against Soviet or Russian aggression, who would have thought that an alliance like that would end up undertaking its biggest international military operation in Central Asia in partnership with not just the original 12 members of the alliance, but with over 40 countries, many of which were alliance members, and many of which were not, and not even from that part of the world.
NATO is an organization which makes major decisions based on consensus of the allies, unanimous agreement of all allies. Why is that important for an organization like NATO?
It's important because the consensus principle gives any NATO ally, big or small, and NATO, of course, is special in the sense that we have one superpower, the United States of America, of course, having by far the most influence in the alliance, but also the United States of America has to deal with Estonia, or the Netherlands for that matter, when there is discussion going on, and the Estonians or the Dutch say, for good arguments, they will definitely argue, we do not agree. And then we have to go on negotiating and go on talking until final consensus is reached. And NATO has operated now almost 75 years in that mode, and it has functioned very well. Many people, also my students at university, say, but this is a burden. This is not an easy process. No, it's not an easy process from time to time, but it is a very important principle to keep the alliance alive and kicking as it has been and as it is.
How has the role of the United States in NATO changed over the years, and also the U.S. role within European security more generally?
What has not changed, Rick, that is the perennial discussion trying to answer the question, who pays what? And still, we are now writing 2024, there is a huge disbalance between what the European allies pay, how they participate financially, and the responsibility of the United States of America. Now, the US is by far the biggest, so we should not be surprised that the brunt goes to the United States of America. But I should immediately add that when the Berlin Wall fell in 1989 and the Soviet Union, after the Cold War, imploded in 1991, we Europeans, we thought, now we can have our cake and eat it. We have subcontracted our security to the United States of America, our energy needs to Russia, Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2, and we have a huge market in China, which is developing into a superpower, for our Renaults, Peugeots, Audi, and BMW cars. And we can import from China all kinds of products we cannot make in Europe at a competitive price. So we thought collectively, and you will remember the famous essay by Francis Fukuyama, the end of history, we thought this is the end of history. If I fast forward, Rick, to now and 2024, June, we're living in a period which I would qualify as the end of history, because the world has now so fundamentally changed. Not one superpower, but two. We have entered China. That has changed the role of the United States of America in the sense that during the Cold War and briefly thereafter, you might remember the United States was considered not even as a super, but as a hyperpower. We thought this is it, and the United States of America will call the shots.
To understand what America's role is within the NATO alliance, and why Americans should care about NATO and the security of Europe, I sat down with Sandy Vershbow, and he's uniquely positioned to talk about NATO, Russia, United States. He served as the U.S. ambassador to NATO from 1997 to 2001, and then the U.S. ambassador to Russia from 2001 to 2005, and later the Deputy Secretary General of NATO from 2012 to 2016. Why is NATO so important for U.S. national security?
Well, I think the short answer is NATO is important because Europe is still very important to our security and our interests. NATO is indispensable to maintaining the security and stability and freedom of our allies. We've been hearing a lot this year when NATO celebrates its 75th anniversary, how it's the most successful alliance in human history. But there have also been skeptical voices who've been asking whether it's time for NATO to take a dignified retirement. I think my time serving at NATO, I was the Deputy Chief of Mission, then the Ambassador in the late 90s, and back as the Deputy Secretary General, including the time of the first Russian aggression against Ukraine. I've came to be convinced that NATO is really the indispensable alliance for the United States and for its other members. It's so important because it works. People always say you have too many members to ever reach consensus on anything. But in fact, because NATO is of such existential importance to member states, they have a kind of a first imperative always in the back of their minds that there has to be a consensus of NATO. It's too important to fail. NATO's original mission, of course, deterring Russian aggression during the Cold War, was fulfilled, but now we're facing an aggressive Russia yet again. NATO has been adaptable in other ways, adopting crisis management as a mission and putting out the civil wars in the Balkans and Bosnia and Kosovo. It took on the war on terrorism after 9/11. And of course, the United States was the first beneficiary of NATO's Article 5, when it was the one and only time that our allies invoked Article 5 to counter the attacks of 9/11. NATO is important in many different ways. I think that even though it's 75 years, you would think it's time for the gold watch. I think it shows its flexibility and adaptability in many ways. And of course, the number one crisis of the day is Russia's war in Ukraine. Here, too, I think we've seen, after some hesitation and even some denial, at just how serious the threat was when it began, particularly back in 2014. I think NATO is now more unified than ever, recognizing that if Russia gets away with annexing somebody else's territory by force and continues to seek to overturn the results of the Cold War, it will create a much more dangerous world for all of us. And that's why I think that NATO has, I think, surprised Mr. Putin in its unity and its resolve in helping Ukraine to resist Russian aggression, and adopted the U.S. line that we're going to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. At the summit, there'll be a lot of attention to the Ukraine fight and what's the next step that we should be taking. I think what's been missing in the U.S. and NATO approach thus far has been the lack of a totally coherent strategy for victory by Ukraine in this war. And I'm hoping that the summit in Washington in July will agree on some additional measures of military support to Ukraine, and at the same time will take steps to put Ukraine on a clearer path to NATO membership, so that we can send the signal to Putin that we're in this for the long haul. We're not going to lose patience or abandon Ukraine. And on the contrary, if we give Ukraine sufficient support, it will be able to regain the initiative on the ground and defeat Russia. So it's sooner or later Putin will have to accept the reality, and he will need to pursue a fair negotiated solution rather than the kind that he's been offering since the invasion began in 2022.
You mentioned NATO, why NATO is important for U.S. national security, but on a more basic level, in light of presidential election in a few months, Why should your average American voter, whether they're in Philadelphia or Phoenix, care about Europe and care about small countries in Europe, for example, the Baltic states, which a lot of observers have said over the years are indefensible? Why should the average American voter care about security in far-flung places such as the Baltic states or other smaller NATO allies?
Well, first of all, Article 5 is indeed kind of the linchpin of NATO, the most solemn fundamental commitment that allies accept when they become members of the alliance. The commitment to treat an attack on one as an attack on all. I think this, together with the strong capabilities that allies deploy, creates a strong deterrent against aggression by Russia or any other state. And if we want to prevent war and not have to face the same disintegration of the European security system that we saw after World War I, then it's important for the U.S. to stay engaged and remember the lessons of history. And that's why keeping NATO strong is in our interest in avoiding much more costly direct intervention down the road if Russia were to attack, and at the same time protecting our political and economic interests, because Europe is our biggest trading partner. Security is the key to keeping investments and trade flows going. Without security, our economy would be damaged too, without security in Europe. So I think that's a very important reason to continue to support NATO and continue to provide the military capabilities to keep it strong and keep the deterrence credible. And of course, what happened in Ukraine made clear that what we were hoping after the end of the Cold War, that we would be able to develop a Europe whole and free with Russia as a partner, which was something we made a lot of progress on actually in the 90s. But after Mr. Putin came into power, he revealed his true colors after a few years, that he was interested in rolling back a lot of the changes at the end of the Cold War and reestablishing some kind of new version of the Russian Empire. So Soviet Union light, I sometimes like to call it. So we thought we had made war unthinkable with the enlargement of NATO and with the NATO-Russia Founding Act, a very important agreement that we reached with Russia in 1997. But Putin made clear that war is very thinkable for him.
How did relations between NATO and Russia, which are in a downward spiral and arguably the lowest that they've been since the end of the Cold War and since your time as Secretary General, how have they gotten so far off track?
Going back a bit, I was foreign minister in 2002, 2003. And the Dutch had the chairmanship in office of the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And in that capacity, because I was that chair, I met Vladimir Putin. In the beginning, that's to be found on the website of the Kremlin. In the beginning, even NATO expansion and NATO enlargement, I mean, Putin didn't like it, but he said in an official resume of our meeting, every nation should finally be free to choose its own destiny. But then comes 2007, the Munich Security Conference, where he uses very strong language vis-à-vis NATO enlargement, vis-à-vis the West more in general. Then comes 2008, where NATO struggles because NATO could basically not agree on Ukraine's future in NATO. And a big political fight erupted between President George W. Bush on the one hand and the German Chancellor on the other hand. Bush wanted to push Ukraine into NATO, and Merkel absolutely refused. The text in the communique was that Ukraine would become a member of NATO, which was a bit of a false promise, in my opinion, because NATO knew then in 2008, I knew at least, and the Allies knew, that NATO could not deliver. As a consequence of that decision, I think Putin invaded Georgia in 2008, 2014 annexation of Crimea, and I would almost say the rest is history. So things they started very well in my active days, but they went for the worse over the years. And my analysis is that it was a deliberate, change of tune and of tone by Putin in 2007, and has nothing to do with NATO enlargement. I mean, the Russians have never liked NATO enlargement, I repeat, but you and I should imagine when NATO would have followed Russia's advice in not to enlarge. What would Europe then have looked like now? What would be the position of the Baltic states and Poland and Central and European nations? The Baltics are on Putin's menu. Moldova is on Putin's menu. Georgia is on Putin's menu. There he does it from the inside, and he should not be allowed to do it from the outside against the other allies.
With the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, we're seeing that Russia is prepared to endure tremendous casualties and equipment losses, but it's not backing away from its extremist objectives, which are nothing short of erasing Ukraine as a sovereign country from the map of Europe, erasing Ukrainian national identity. So for Ukraine, of course, it's a genocidal war, it's an existential war. And I think if we don't want to be more directly engaged, now is the time to ramp up our military support to Ukraine, not be so selective or incremental as we have been since this war began, but to pull out all the stops, give them everything they need to put Russia on the back foot and eventually to drive Russia out of occupied lands in Ukraine. And then hopefully new leaders will emerge sooner or later in Russia, more interested than Putin in going back to that path of partnership and cooperation that we had offered Russia in the late 80s and early 90s.
You served as the U.S. ambassador to Russia from 2001 to 2005. This was a much different time in U.S.-Russian relations, arguably much better time. How did the U.S./NATO relationship with Russia go so far off track? And what role, in your view, has enlargement had in this downward spiral?
As I mentioned earlier, in a very hopeful time, particularly after 1991, when the Soviet Union itself dissolved peacefully before our very eyes, and the Berlin Wall was down and the Warsaw Pact was gone, it was an opportunity to erase dividing lines in Europe that had existed since the Yalta Summit during World War II. And our vision always included not only enlarging NATO to accept new members, but a strategic partnership with Russia, recognizing its place in European security. So we made some headway during the Yeltsin years, and even at the beginning of the Putin years, he seemed fairly pragmatic and was interested in deepening the relationship with NATO. He even attended a special summit in Rome in 2002, where NATO and Russia upgraded their partnership, established a new permanent council, and started to work together on missile defense, on counterterrorism, and many other issues. I think what caused Putin to kind of sour on his relationship with NATO in the West was not primarily NATO enlargement. Remember, there was a second and third round of enlargement during Putin's time, including the admission of the Baltic states, which people used to think were a non-starter for Putin. It was hardly a peep out of Moscow. I think they recognized that there was no military danger, and they continued, in fact, to move more and more of their troops away from the western flank to the south and to the east to deal with terrorism and other common problems. For Putin, the real driver of his anti-NATO policies that began kind of with a vengeance in 2007 at the time of his famous speech to the Munich Security Conference was his sense that he was losing control over the former Soviet space, and in particular Ukraine, which had almost mystical significance in his version of history. And first big watershed event was the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2004, where the Russians interfered in an election hoping to install their favorite son, Viktor Yanukovych, as president. Like many of Putin's interventions in Ukraine, it backfired and made things worse. Yet in 2010, he got Yanukovych in there fair and square, but then undermined Yanukovych, who had accepted neutrality and who gave the Russians a 40-year lease on the Black Sea Fleet's base in Sevastopol. But he was greedy, and he wanted to dominate Ukraine, and ended up prompting the Popular Revolution that first in 2004 and then in 2014, the Maidan. So it was really always about controlling Ukraine, not about what NATO was doing. Putin's main driver has always been to control Ukraine, that he couldn't afford to have a successful democratic state on Russia's borders, which would tell Russians that they could have a democracy rather than an autocracy, as Putin is insisting is the only way for Russia to go forward.
What big announcements or decisions do you expect or hope to see come out of that summit?
I think there'll be a lot of attention to these different programs that have been undertaken over the last 10 years since the annexation of Crimea to transform NATO's defense and deterrence strategy, force posture, and to start marshaling the significant resources that are needed to deliver on these plans, particularly what's called the new family of defense plans, in which we now pre-assigning forces to ensure that we have the significant capabilities able to beat back Russian aggression, whether it's in the north, in the south, or in the middle. And I think there will be also related to this is initiatives to ramp up defense industrial production, because one of the main problems supplying Ukraine has been that the cupboards are increasingly bare and the production lines are not as active, not active at all, and need to be activated on a much more urgent basis if we're going to be able to keep up with the Russians, who have reconstituted their forces very rapidly, keep up with their superior numbers in artillery, ammunitions, drones, tactical ballistic missiles. So a defense industrial initiative is likely. But of course, the spotlight will be on the larger political strategy toward Ukraine. Do we have a strategy for victory? Are we still united and ready to give them everything they need to reverse some of the recent losses, which were exacerbated by the impasse in the U.S. Congress over funding, and whether we'll stop kind of micromanaging every single supply decision, giving the Russians the impression that they can sometimes threaten and intimidate us and get us to kind of self-deter from giving the Ukrainians all they need. Alongside arming Ukraine and winning the war is securing the peace. And I think allies are increasingly in agreement that in the long term, Ukraine will never be secure unless it's a member of NATO. Without that Article 5 deterrent, they might try something again in a few years' time. But it's still a sensitive point on when and how Ukraine can join, even though allies agree that Ukraine's future is in NATO. I'm hoping that there'll be some, at least, positive steps towards integrating Ukrainian armed forces and defense policymakers more in the NATO consultative framework, putting NATO more directly in charge of the overall military support effort for Ukraine. And as a result, kind of putting Ukraine closer to walking through the open door, even though a political decision on that may have to await either an end of the war or a substantial dying down of the fighting.
Even at short notice, Rick, what will be the Washington summit language, communique language on Ukraine and NATO? They had in Vilnius, they had a text, I say it in my own words, Ukraine can become a member of NATO when circumstances allow, when conditions are met, which means as long as there's a war going on, Ukraine cannot become a member of NATO. Although I go back to 2008, we promised them NATO membership. So what will be the DC Washington language when NATO celebrates its 75th birthday? It should be a bit more, I hope, than Vilnius, because you can't use the same phrase twice, in my opinion. The Ukraine file will be prominently on his desk. And let's not forget, there are other nations knocking on NATO's door as well. Thinking about the Western Balkans, that will of course not happen overnight. Then finally, we discussed it as well. Finally, of course, he will have to travel around intensively to see that the financial burden is more equally distributed, and he'll also wait with great interest what the American people is going to do on November 5th, which president they're going to choose, and what consequences that choice might have for the alliance. But I repeat again, we European allies will have to establish a relationship with whatever president the United States people are going to choose. There might be differences, there might be big differences between the two, but I do hope that NATO stays very much alive and kicking as it has now been for 75 years.
Thank you for joining us. Our guests were all incredibly generous with their time, so we do really encourage you to hear all of their insights in the complete interviews and transcripts, which are available in the link in the description of this episode. And join us in a few weeks as we debrief after the Washington Summit. This has been The Ties That Bind, NATO at 75 and Beyond, a podcast of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. For more podcasts, analysis, and to learn about upcoming events, please visit us at fpri.org.